Right now, without doing anything at all, the air moving in and out of your lungs contains a few molecules of oxygen that were released sometime in the last few years by something standing very still, somewhere on this planet, in the dark, doing nothing that looked like work. You didn't ask for this. You don't have to thank anyone. It simply happened, the way so many quiet exchanges happen between your body and the world without your permission or your attention, and it's still happening now, this breath and the next one. You can let your eyes close if they haven't already. There's nothing here to study, no test at the end, no list to keep in order, no names you have to hold on to past the moment they're spoken. If a fact slips out of your grip and floats away into sleep, that's not a failure of listening. That's just what this is for. Tonight we're going to sit beside a tree, not looking at a diagram of one, not memorizing its parts the way you might have in a classroom with fluorescent lights humming overhead and a worksheet waiting to be filled in. Just sitting. In the dark, beside something enormous and unhurried, something that has been standing in roughly the same spot since before you were born, and will likely still be standing there, if it's left alone, long after you're gone. Picture it however you like. Maybe it's an oak with bark like the cracked hide of some old animal, or a birch, pale as bone in the moonlight, or a pine that smells faintly of resin and rain, even from a few feet away. It doesn't matter which one you're imagining. What matters is that it's there, and it's not moving, and yet it is doing more, right now, in this stillness, than almost anything else you could point to in the dark around you. Here is the first strange and comforting thing to know about a tree, if you know nothing else. It is not one thing. We tend to talk about trees the way we talk about people, as single beings with a name and an outline, something you could trace with your finger. But a tree is closer to a city than a person. It's a gathering, a long-running agreement between parts that don't especially resemble each other, held together by habit and need, and something that isn't quite intention, but behaves a little like it. Below the ground, invisible to you as you sit there in the grass or the leaf litter, there are roots. Not just the thick ones that sometimes push up through the soil near the trunk like the knuckles of a buried hand, but a much finer, much stranger network beneath them, threading out in every direction, some of it hair-thin, reaching toward water the way your own fingers might reach for something in the dark of a room you know well enough to navigate blind. Those roots are drinking, slowly, constantly, without fanfare, pulling water up out of the soil the way a candle wick pulls wax upward toward the flame, except there's no flame here, just a quiet pressure, a pull that starts at the very top of the tree, at the leaves, and travels all the way down to the tips of the roots, asking for more. And above the roots, holding all of this upright against gravity, against wind, against the ordinary violence of weather, there is wood. You've touched wood 1,000 times without thinking much about what it actually is. It isn't simply a building material, the way a plank at a hardware store might suggest. It's closer to a kind of plumbing, crossed with a skeleton, made of countless tiny tubes, most of them already dead by the time you'd call the tree alive, stacked one on top of another for years, sometimes centuries, each one a record of a season that happened and then ended. The tree doesn't discard its old selves. It wears them, layered underneath the living surface, the way a candle might keep every inch it's already burned down through, except stacked outward instead of gone. Then there's the part most people picture first when they hear the word tree, the leaves, small green machines, if you'll allow a slightly clumsy comparison, though machine isn't quite the right word for something that grew itself out of sunlight and air, rather than being built by hands. Each leaf is doing something that, if you slowed it down and looked closely enough, would seem almost unbelievable. Taking in light, actual photons traveling 93 million miles from a star, and using that light to split water apart, to pull carbon out of the very air around you, and to stitch those pieces together into sugar, into food, into the substance that will become more wood, more root, more leaf, more tree. This is happening in countless leaves on countless trees at this very moment, somewhere on the sunlit side of the earth, though not, of course, where you are right now, in the dark, where the leaves near you are resting the way you're about to rest, waiting for morning to start the work again. But here's where the story gets a little larger, a little less tidy, in a way I think you'll find easier to drift off to than any story with hard edges. A tree cannot actually do all of this alone. For a long time, people pictured a tree as a self-sufficient thing, sturdy and solitary, pulling itself up out of the ground purely through its own effort, the way you might picture someone building a house entirely by themselves. But that picture leaves out most of what's actually going on. Down in the soil, wrapped around and even growing directly into the fine hair-like roots we talked about a moment ago, there are threads of fungus, so thin you'd need a microscope to really appreciate them, forming a kind of underground lace that extends the tree's reach far beyond what its own roots could manage alone. In exchange for sugar, the food the tree makes up in its leaves, these fungal threads bring back water and minerals from soil the roots themselves could never have touched. It's a trade, an old one, older than trees as we'd recognize them today, going back further than you might expect into the deep, slow history of life, finding ways to share the work of staying alive. And it doesn't stop there. In the soil, on the bark, drifting in through the stomata, the tiny mouth-like openings on the underside of every leaf, there are microbes too small to see, bacteria and other organisms doing their own quiet business, some helping the tree, some simply living alongside it, the way any of us live alongside countless creatures we never notice. A tree, in other words, is not really a single living thing standing apart from the world. It's more like a slow, patient partnership. Roots and wood and leaves and water and light and fungi and microbes, all working together across a time scale so much longer than a human day, a human year, sometimes even a human life, that it can be hard to hold in your mind all at once. That's all right. You don't have to hold it all at once. You don't have to hold any of it, really. Let it settle the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water without your needing to guide it there. Somewhere out in the dark tonight, a tree very much like the one you're imagining is standing exactly where it stood yesterday, its roots pulling water it doesn't need until morning, its wood holding steady against a breeze too gentle to really call wind, its leaves closed down for the night the way your own eyes are closing now. It isn't waiting for anything. It isn't hurrying toward anything either. It's simply continuing, the way it has continued, one quiet season folding into the next, for longer than most of what you'd call history. And in a little while, we'll follow one of those roots down into the soil, into the dark, patient world just beneath the surface, to see what it's actually doing down there, while everything above ground rests. Before we follow that root down into the dark soil it knows so well, it might be worth going back further. Further than the tree itself, further than the sapling it once was, back to a time before there was a root at all to follow, when everything this tree would ever become was folded up inside something small enough to rest in the palm of your hand, a seed. It's strange to think about, but every tree you've ever stood beneath, every one whose shade has ever fallen across your shoulders on a warm afternoon, began as something you could have lost track of in a coat pocket. A maple seed, with its little papery wing, weighs less than a paperclip. An acorn is barely heavier than a large grape, and yet folded inside each one, pressed into a space almost too small to imagine, is the complete, quiet blueprint for 100 feet of wood and leaf and root. Waiting. Waiting is really the right word for it too, because a seed spends most of its existence doing exactly that. Not growing, not reaching, just waiting, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years, sometimes, in certain remarkable cases, for far longer than that. There's a kind of patience built into a seed that we don't often find elsewhere in the living world, a patience so complete it has a name of its own. Dormancy. It's the seed equivalent of sleep, though deeper and stranger than any sleep you or I will have tonight. A dormant seed has slowed its inner processes down to something close to nothing. Its cells aren't dividing. Its chemistry isn't building anything new. It is, in every meaningful sense, paused, holding its place in time until the world outside gives it a reason not to be. And what a seed is protecting during all that waiting is worth pausing on for a moment. Picture the outermost layer first, the seed coat, a thin, tough shell wrapped snugly around everything inside. Depending on the species, this coat might be smooth and hard, like the polished brown shell of a horse chestnut, or thin and papery, like the covering on a sunflower seed, or fibrous and almost woody, the way it is on a walnut. Whatever its texture, its job is largely the same everywhere. It keeps water out until the seed is ready for water. It keeps insects and fungi from getting in and helping themselves to what's stored beneath. It can even, in some species, keep the seed itself from cracking open too early, before conditions are right, the way a good winter coat keeps you buttoned up against weather you're not ready to face yet. Inside that coat, the seed carries two things, really, packed close together. One is the embryo, the barely formed beginning of the plant itself, so small and undeveloped it hardly resembles a tree at all, more like an idea of a tree than the thing itself. A few cells arranged in a particular pattern that already, somehow, knows which end will become root and which end will become shoot. The other is food. Not food in the way we usually think of it, but stored energy, usually in the form of starches and oils, packed in around or alongside that tiny embryo-like provisions, loaded onto a ship before a long voyage. In some seeds, this stored food fills a separate tissue called the endosperm. In others, like beans, it's tucked into the seed's own first leaves, folded up and waiting to be used. Either way, the purpose is the same. That young embryo, once it wakes, will have no leaves yet, no way to make its own food through sunlight, and no roots yet either, no way to draw anything up from the soil. For those first delicate days, it will be living entirely off the food its parent packed for it, the way a traveler lives off what's in their bag before they've had the chance to find a market or hunt or grow anything of their own. So the seed sits, sealed and provisioned, waiting for a signal. And this is one of the quietly remarkable things about seeds, how differently that signal can arrive, depending on the species and the place it evolved to survive. For some seeds, the trigger is simply water and warmth arriving together, the ordinary conditions of a mild spring after a wet winter. Moisture seeps in through a tiny opening in the seed coat, the tissues inside begin to swell, and the whole system starts to wake, cell by cell, the way your own body stirs when morning light finally reaches your eyelids. For other seeds, water and warmth alone aren't enough, and this is on purpose. A seed that woke at the first hint of warmth, say during an unusually mild week in the middle of winter, might send its tender first shoot up right into a hard frost days later, and all that patient waiting would be wasted in a single cold night. So certain trees have evolved a more cautious kind of alarm clock. Some seeds need a genuine stretch of cold first, weeks of near-freezing temperatures, before they'll respond to warmth at all, a process sometimes called stratification, as though the seed is keeping a kind of internal calendar, refusing to believe spring has truly arrived until its confident winter has properly finished. Other seeds respond to fire, their coats built thick and resistant, until intense heat finally cracks them open, a strategy suited to forests, where fire has always been part of the landscape, clearing space and light for a new generation right at the moment the old one has burned back. Still others wait for their coat to be worn down by the acid in an animal's stomach, passing through a bird or a mammal before they're released, ready to grow, often deposited some distance away, with a small package of fertilizer included, courtesy of whatever ate them. Once the right signal finally arrives, though, and the seed does wake, the sequence that follows tends to be remarkably consistent across an enormous range of species. Water is drawn in first, softening the seed coat and swelling the tissues inside. Then, almost always, the root comes before anything else. It has to. A young plant with no roots has no way to reliably reach water once its stored supply runs low, so the first visible sign of germination is usually a small white thread pushing downward, called the radicle, feeling its way into the soil the way a hand might feel along a dark wall for a light switch. Only after that root has begun its work, anchoring the seed and starting to draw in a little moisture of its own, does the shoot begin its own upward journey, bending sometimes in a small hook shape to protect its delicate tip as it pushes through soil that, from the seed's perspective, might as well be an entire world's weight pressing down from above. And here is a small, quiet marvel worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. That shoot, still underground, still in total darkness, somehow knows which way is up. It isn't guessing. Cells within the stem respond to gravity itself, a sense we don't usually credit plants with having at all, bending and growing in the one direction that will eventually bring it to light, while the root, sensing that same pull, curves the opposite way, downward, deeper, following gravity rather than resisting it. Up above, we experience gravity as something we simply live inside of, rarely thinking about it at all. A seedling, in its first hours of life, is already listening to it, using it as a compass, in a world with no other landmarks yet to guide it. It's a beginning, built almost entirely on trust, really. Trust that the stored food will last long enough. Trust that the season read correctly by warmth or cold or fire was read correctly indeed. Trust, in its own wordless way, that up is still up, and that somewhere above the dark press of soil there is light waiting to be reached. And it's down into that same dark, patient world, the very soil this small root is now beginning to explore, that we'll travel next. Let's follow that root down, slowly, the way it moves itself, which is to say, not quickly at all. If you could shrink yourself small enough to walk alongside its tip, you would notice first that the very end of the root is protected by something like a tiny helmet, a cap of cells called, fittingly, the root cap. This cap is soft and almost slippery, and it exists for one simple reason. The soil ahead is not empty space waiting politely to be occupied. It is packed, grain against grain, with sand and clay and stone, and the crumbled remains of countless other lives that came before. Pushing through that is a little like pushing your hand through wet sand at the edge of a lake, except the root cannot see what it's pushing against, and it cannot pull back to try again. So the cells of the cap sacrifice themselves, quite literally, wearing away and sloughing off as the root inches forward, and even releasing a kind of slippery mucilage that eases the friction, the plant's own version of a lubricant, spread thin across the world's smallest and slowest drill bit. Just behind that cap is the part of the root doing the actual work of getting longer, a zone where cells are dividing again and again, impossibly small copies of themselves, stacking up one after another. And behind that division zone comes something quieter and, in its way, more remarkable, a zone of elongation, where those newly made cells stop dividing and instead simply stretch, lengthening like dough being pulled, and it is this stretching, more than anything else, that pushes the root tip forward into new soil. The growing part of a root, then, is never very long at all. It might only be a few millimeters. Everything above that has already finished growing and will stay more or less where it is for the rest of its life, thickening perhaps, but not extending further. It's a strange thought that a root 100 feet long only ever grew from its very last few millimeters, over and over, year after year, the way a story only ever gets longer at its final page. As the root ages just slightly, just behind that elongation zone, something else appears, something so fine you'd need to get quite close to see it at all. Tiny hairs, thinner than the finest thread, begin sprouting sideways from the root's surface, sometimes numbering in the thousands on a single inch of root. These are root hairs, and despite their almost invisible size, they may be the single most important structure in the entire underground world of the plant, because they exist for exactly one purpose: to increase surface area, to give the root as much possible contact with the soil around it as can be managed. A root without hairs is like a hand pressed flat against a wall. A root with hairs is like that same hand, except now every pore of the skin has grown its own tiny finger, reaching into every crack and crevice the wall has to offer. Each hair works its way between individual grains of soil, wrapping partway around them, pressing into the thin films of water that cling to almost every particle of earth, however dry that earth might look from above. And that water is not simply sitting there waiting to be scooped up. It clings to soil particles by the same kind of attraction that lets water bead up on a leaf or climb slightly up the inside of a glass, a faint stubbornness molecules have toward touching surfaces and each other. The root hair has to work against that stubbornness, and it does so by keeping the inside of its cells slightly saltier, in effect, than the water just outside, which by the plain logic of diffusion, of things naturally moving toward balance, draws that water inward, cell by cell, hair by hair, drop by imperceptible drop. It is not a pump in any mechanical sense. There is no muscle down there, no beating heart pushing fluid through pipes. It is closer to persuasion than force, water moving because it is, in a very real chemical sense, more comfortable moving that way than staying put. Dissolved in that water, riding along almost as passengers, are minerals the plant cannot make for itself, no matter how much sunlight it gathers above ground. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a long list of others needed only in the barest traces: magnesium for building the green pigment in leaves, iron for helping certain vital reactions run smoothly, tiny amounts of things like zinc and boron whose absence, though the plant needs so little of them, can still stunt or twist its growth in ways easy to notice and hard to trace back to their true cause. None of this comes free, and none of it comes from photosynthesis. It comes only from soil, and only through these hairs, patient and countless, doing this same small work in the dark, while everything interesting, as far as most of us are concerned, seems to be happening up in the light. The roots don't stop at simply drinking either. Below the surface, out of sight and easy to forget about entirely, an entire second version of the tree is quietly taking shape, branching and rebranching, thickening in some places and staying thread-fine in others, often spreading, in total length if you could somehow unspool and lay it flat, further than the branches above ever reach. Some trees send one or several thick roots straight down, deep taproots reaching for water tables far below where a casual observer would ever think to look, anchoring the whole structure the way a tent stake driven deep holds firm against wind no ordinary knot could resist. Other trees spread wide instead of deep, a shallow lattice radiating outward well past the edge of the branches above, sometimes extending 2 or even 3 times as far sideways as the tree is tall, catching every light rain before it can sink too far to reach, and providing a wide, stable base against toppling, the way a wide-legged stance holds a person steadier than standing with feet close together. Most trees, it turns out, do a bit of both, a compromise struck slowly over generations between the competing demands of depth and reach, dictated as much by the particular soil a given seed happened to land in as by anything fixed in the tree's own nature. And threaded through this whole system, at a scale even finer than the root hairs themselves, is a kind of quiet partnership so widespread that some who study soil now consider it closer to the rule than the exception. Slender filaments of fungus, called hyphae, extend from the root surface out into soil the root itself could never reach alone, sometimes reaching hundreds of times further than the root hairs manage on their own. In exchange for sugars the tree has made using nothing but sunlight and air, sugars the fungus, lacking any leaves of its own, simply cannot produce. These fungal threads pass back water and minerals gathered from soil far beyond the root's own boundary, phosphorus especially, an element that moves through soil so slowly and so unevenly that a root's own hairs, however numerous, would take far longer to find it unassisted. It's a trade struck in near total silence, no signal we can hear, no visible negotiation, and yet astonishingly precise in its balance, each partner seeming to know, cell by cell, roughly what it's owed. Some researchers who have followed these threads carefully suspect they may connect not just one tree to the soil, but tree to tree, an underground web joining separate trunks that, standing above ground, look for all the world like solitary individuals. It is worth resting on that thought for a moment before we go on, because it changes, just slightly, what a tree even is. Not simply a trunk and a crown reaching upward into weather and light, but also this other half, hidden, slow-moving, endlessly branching downward into darkness, drinking, storing, trading, holding on. And it is that storing we'll turn to next, because roots do not only gather. In their own patient way, they also remember, keeping something set aside for seasons not yet arrived. Consider, then, what a root actually sets aside. Through the long stretch of summer, when leaves are working hardest and sugars flow downward in abundance, a portion of that sugar doesn't simply feed the root's growth or its fungal partners. Some of it is converted instead into starch, packed away in living cells scattered through the root's own tissue, tucked into small storage chambers, the way a household might fill a pantry shelf by shelf across a good harvest, without any single dramatic act of saving, just steady, unhurried accumulation. Come the leafless months, when there is no sunlight reaching functioning leaves and no new sugar being made. That starch can be converted back, quietly, into the sugars the tree needs simply to stay alive, to keep its living cells breathing, even while everything above ground looks, to any passerby, entirely still. It is a kind of memory, if we allow ourselves the word, not held in any nervous system, because trees have none, but held all the same, chemically, in reserve, ready to be called upon. That reserve, though, cannot stay hidden underground forever. It has to travel, upward, sometimes 60 or 80, or, in the oldest giants, well over 300 feet. And to understand how that journey happens, and how it's protected along the way, we have to leave the roots behind for now and follow the trunk itself, climbing, slowly, the way a curious child might, hand over hand, into the part of the tree most of us actually picture when we hear the word. Run your palm across the bark of almost any mature tree, and the first thing you notice is how little it resembles skin, at least in the soft sense we usually mean by that word. It's closer to armor, dry and often deeply fissured, sometimes peeling in papery curls, sometimes cracked into plates like the dried bed of a summer pond. And that roughness isn't incidental. Bark is largely dead tissue by the time we touch it. Cells that lived briefly, did their work, and then, in a sense, sacrificed themselves to become a wall. That wall keeps out fungal spores drifting on the wind, keeps insects from tunneling straight through to softer tissue beneath, keeps moisture from evaporating too quickly from the trunk's interior, and in some species, particularly certain pines, it even holds a kind of built-in fire resistance, thick and corky and slow to burn, a trait shaped, we believe, by countless seasons of wildfire moving through the same landscapes those trees return to, generation after generation. But bark, for all its toughness, is only the outermost layer of a trunk built in distinct, concentric zones, rather like the layers of a coat someone has pulled on for a long walk in cold weather, each one serving a slightly different purpose, from the roughest outer shell to the softest core. Just beneath the bark lies a thin band of living tissue called the phloem, and it's worth pausing on this layer especially, because it's doing something remarkably similar to what happens in our own circulatory systems, carrying dissolved sugar, the very sugar made in leaves through photosynthesis, down through the trunk and out into the branches and roots that cannot make their own food. This is why, if a ring of bark and the phloem beneath it is stripped away all the way around a trunk, a practice sometimes called girdling, the tree above that wound may go on living for a surprisingly long while, still drawing water upward, still holding its leaves, and yet it is, in effect, already starving, cut off from the food its own leaves are making just a short distance above the wound, unable to send it down to feed the roots. Just inside the phloem, thinner still, almost too thin to see with the naked eye, lies the layer that makes the whole structure possible in the first place, a ring of actively dividing cells called the vascular cambium. This is, in a real sense, the tree's growth engine, and it works with a patience that's easy to underestimate. Each growing season, cells in this thin ring divide, and depending on which direction a new cell finds itself pushed, it becomes either phloem added to the outside, carrying food downward, or xylem added to the inside, which we'll come to in a moment. It's a strange kind of construction, in that the builder itself is the thinnest layer of all, sandwiched permanently between the two structures it's endlessly producing, never itself becoming very thick, always staying just where it is, quietly dividing, year after year, for as long as the tree lives. The xylem, laid down toward the inside of that cambium, is where the trunk's true bulk comes from, and it serves a purpose almost the mirror image of the phloem's, where phloem carries sugar downward from the leaves. Xylem carries water, drawn up from the roots, upward through the trunk, and out into the branches, and finally into the leaves themselves, sometimes against odds that seem almost to defy plain intuition, water rising, without any pump, any beating heart, any muscle at all, powered instead by a combination of forces, including the simple, relentless evaporation of water from tiny pores in the leaves, which pulls a continuous thread of water upward behind it, cell by cell, the way pulling one end of a long, unbroken string of beads draws the whole string along behind it. Not all xylem, though, is doing this work at once. Only the outermost rings, collectively called sapwood, are actively involved in moving water upward in any given year. Toward the center of the trunk lies heartwood, tissue that was once sapwood itself, decades or centuries earlier, but has since become plugged and hardened, no longer transporting water, serving instead as pure structural support, the tree's own dense internal scaffolding. In many species, this heartwood darkens noticeably, sometimes dramatically, as resins and other compounds are deposited into it, which is part of why walnut or cherry heartwood carries such a rich, warm color, while the sapwood surrounding it stays pale and comparatively plain, a contrast anyone who has ever sanded down a piece of old furniture has likely noticed without quite knowing why it was there. And this, layer by layer, ring by ring, is how a trunk quietly gains its girth. In climates with a clear difference between seasons, the cells the cambium produces in spring, when water is plentiful and growth comes easily, tend to be larger and lighter in color, while the cells produced later in summer, as conditions tighten, grow smaller and denser, darker under the eye. The result, over a single year, is one visible ring, a pale band followed by a darker one, and it's by counting these paired bands, patiently, ring by ring, that we can read a tree's age directly from its own body, sometimes even matching unusually thin or unusually wide rings to specific years of drought or abundance recorded nowhere else, no ledger, no letter, no memory but the wood itself. Not every year leaves so tidy a record, though, and not every trunk grows in such a straightforward, even fashion. Sometimes a branch, as it thickens where it meets the trunk, leaves behind a knot, a dense, swirling knuckle of wood, visible for anyone who has ever handled a rough-cut plank and traced their fingers around one of those distinctive dark whorls. And when a trunk or branch grows on a lean, perhaps reaching for light that falls unevenly, or bent for years by a prevailing wind that never lets up, the tree responds by laying down what's known as reaction wood, tissue built with a different structure than usual, denser on one side than the other, quietly working, season after season, to correct the lean, or at least to keep the whole structure from toppling under its own considerable weight. None of this, the bark, the cambium, the rising water, the settling rings, happens with any sense of urgency. It is slow work, built in thicknesses too thin to notice in any single season, and it's worth sitting with that pace for a while, because there is still more of the trunk's story left to follow, upward now, out toward the branches themselves, and further still, into the leaves that started this whole quiet current of sugar and water in the first place. Let's go there now, into the leaf itself, since that is where this whole slow story really begins, and where, if we're honest, it never quite stops beginning again. Every single day the sun is up. Picture an ordinary leaf, something you might have picked up off a sidewalk without a second thought, maple or oak or something plainer still, and imagine shrinking down until its surface stretches out beneath you like a green landscape. Most of what you'd notice, at first, is how quiet it all seems. But look closer, especially at the underside, the pale, less glossy side that usually faces down and away from direct sun, and you'll start to find small openings, oval in shape, each one bordered by a pair of specialized cells, shaped a little like two curved parentheses, facing each other. These are called stomata, from a Greek word meaning mouths, And mouths is not a bad way to think of them, though what passes through these particular mouths is mostly gas, not food. A single leaf might hold many thousands of these openings, scattered in a pattern too fine for the unaided eye, and each one can be adjusted, opened wider or narrowed to almost nothing, by the two guard cells that flank it, cells that swell or relax depending on the water pressure inside them, on the light falling on the leaf, on the carbon dioxide level in the air just outside. It's a strange thing to sit with, that a leaf is breathing in its own slow way through thousands of tiny adjustable mouths, all day, all season, without any lungs at all. Why bother with an opening like this in the first place? Because the leaf needs something from the air that it cannot get any other way, and that something is carbon dioxide, the same gas we breathe out, present in the atmosphere in only a small fraction, but essential all the same. Every time a stoma opens, carbon dioxide drifts in, driven simply by the fact that there's less of it inside the leaf's tissue than outside in the air, and gases tend to spread themselves out evenly if given the chance. Once inside, that carbon dioxide finds its way into the spongy layer of cells that makes up the leaf's interior, cells packed loosely enough to leave air pockets between them, rather like the inside of a piece of bread, and it's here, inside these cells, that the real work of the leaf takes place, work carried out by small green structures called chloroplasts. If you've ever wondered why leaves are green in the first place, chlorophyll is the answer, a pigment held inside those chloroplasts, and it's green for a very particular reason. It absorbs red light and blue light from the sunlight falling on it, using the energy from both ends of that visible spectrum, but it reflects green light back out, largely unused, which is the color that then reaches our eyes. So in a real sense, the color we love leaves for is the color they're rejecting, not the color they're using. What chlorophyll actually captures, that red and blue light, gets funneled into an elaborate sequence of chemical steps, the details of which took scientists the better part of 2 centuries to work out fully, piece by piece, through careful and often painstaking experiments. But the outcome, however intricate the pathway, comes down to something almost startlingly simple to describe, even if it is anything but simple to carry out. Using the energy from that captured light, the leaf takes the carbon dioxide it drew in through its stomata and combines it with water pulled up from the roots, and out of that combination it builds sugar, a simple, stable molecule the tree can use immediately for energy or store away for later, and it releases oxygen as a byproduct, the same oxygen we and every other breathing creature depend on, drifting back out through those same small openings into the air. It's worth pausing on that word, byproduct, because it captures something true about the whole arrangement that we don't always appreciate. The tree isn't making oxygen for us. It's making sugar for itself, and oxygen is simply what's left over once the water molecule has been taken apart for its components. We happen to need that leftover badly. Every breath we take depends on it, but from the leaf's perspective, oxygen is closer to exhaust than to product. Sugar is only half of the leaf's chemical life, though, because the tree also needs to burn some of that sugar to get anything useful done with it, to grow, to repair damaged tissue, to keep its cells functioning through the night when no light falls at all. This second process is called respiration, and in some ways it runs the photosynthesis story backward. The tree takes in oxygen, uses it to break sugar back down, and releases carbon dioxide and water as it does. Respiration happens constantly, day and night, in every living cell, not just in the leaves, while photosynthesis only happens in the green tissue, and only while there's enough light to drive it. During the day, a healthy leaf usually makes more sugar through photosynthesis than it burns through respiration, which is the whole point. That's the surplus the tree lives on and grows from. But at night, with the light gone, respiration continues alone, quietly spending down a little of what the day put by. Now, back to those stomata, because the same small openings that let carbon dioxide in for photosynthesis have a second effect, one that's much harder for the tree to control precisely, and it's this. Every time a stoma opens to let carbon dioxide in, water vapor slips out through the very same opening, drawn by the same basic principle, moving from where there's more of it, inside the moist leaf, to where there's less of it, in the drier air outside. This loss of water vapor through the leaves is called transpiration, and for most trees, it accounts for the overwhelming majority of water they ever take up through their roots, far more than what actually gets used in building sugar. A single large tree, on a warm, dry day, can lose many dozens of gallons of water this way, water vapor rising invisibly off its leaves, and this is not incidental or wasteful so much as it is simply the price of doing business, the unavoidable cost of keeping those doors open long enough to gather carbon dioxide. And here is where transpiration turns out to matter for far more than just water balance, because that steady loss of water vapor from the leaves is what keeps the whole column of water moving upward through the tree in the first place, from root to trunk to branch to leaf. As water evaporates out through a stoma, it pulls at the water molecule behind it in the leaf's tissue, and because water molecules cling to each other rather tightly, a property called cohesion, that gentle pull travels backward down through the leaf's veins, into the twig, down the branch, down the trunk, through the narrow xylem vessels we've already followed water climbing through, and all the way down into the finest root hairs, drawing up more water from the soil to replace what was lost. It is, in essence, a very long, very thin, unbroken thread of water, held together by its own cohesion, being tugged upward from the top, and this tug, more than any pump or muscle the tree might otherwise need, is what carries water dozens or even over 100 feet skyward in the tallest trees, without a single moving part, all of which leaves the tree walking a fine, constant line, day after day. Open the stomata wide, and carbon dioxide flows in generously. Sugar production climbs, but water rushes out just as freely. And on a hot, dry day, that could mean losing more water than the roots can replace. Close the stomata down tight to conserve that water, and the leaf stays hydrated, but carbon dioxide can barely get in, and photosynthesis slows nearly to a stop. There is no setting that solves both problems at once, no permanent compromise. So instead, the guard cells around every stoma are adjusting themselves in something close to real time, opening a little more when light is plentiful and moisture is not scarce, narrowing when the air turns dry or the sun climbs fierce and high. An endless small negotiation between hunger for carbon and thirst for water, repeated across thousands of tiny mouths, in every leaf, on every tree, all through the waking hours of the day. That daily negotiation, though, repeated stoma by stoma through every bright hour of the growing season, is only the smallest and fastest of the rhythms a tree keeps. Underneath it runs a much slower, much larger clock, one that takes a full year to complete a single turn, and if you were to follow one ordinary tree, say a sugar maple standing at the edge of a field, all the way around that turn, you would see almost everything else we have talked about finally come together into a kind of unhurried performance. The story does not really begin in spring, as it might seem to. It begins the previous summer, when the tree was already building the buds it would need. Look closely at any twig in July, and near the tip you will find small hard nubs, tightly wrapped in overlapping scales, brownish and faintly resinous to the touch, and inside each one, invisible without a hand lens, sits a fully formed miniature leaf, or a cluster of flower parts, folded and pleated like fabric packed for a long trip, waiting. Those scales are not decoration. They are insulation and armor at once, shielding the delicate tissue inside from drying wind, from ice, from the freeze-thaw cycling of a long cold season, the way a sleeping bag's shell keeps the loft inside from collapsing. The tree, in other words, has already done next spring's planning work months in advance, and then it simply waits, sometimes for the better part of half a year, for the right signal to unwrap what it packed. That signal is not one thing but a conversation between two separate senses. The tree tracks day length through a light-sensitive pigment called phytochrome that shifts its shape depending on the ratio of red to far red light it absorbs, giving the tree something close to an internal calendar even on a cloudy day when the sun itself is hard to judge. And it tracks temperature, both the accumulating warmth of a mild stretch and, curiously, a prior requirement for cold. Many trees native to temperate climates actually need a certain number of chilling hours below a threshold temperature over the winter before they will respond to spring warmth at all, a safeguard against being fooled by a random January thaw into breaking bud weeks too early, only to be killed by the frost that inevitably follows. Only once both conditions are satisfied, sufficient chill banked, then sufficient warmth arriving, do the bud scales finally loosen, swell, and peel back, and the small leaf or flower, cluster inside, unfurls into daylight for the first time, pale and soft and faintly sticky, nothing like the tough, weathered leaf it will become within weeks. For many trees, flowering happens first, sometimes before a single leaf has opened, and if you have ever walked beneath a maple or an oak or a birch in early spring and wondered why the ground was dusted with a fine yellow-green powder, or why your car sat under a faint haze some mornings, you were witnessing wind pollination in progress. These trees produce flowers so small and unshowy that most people never register them as flowers at all. No petals to speak of, no scent, no nectar reward, because none of that is needed when the pollen is simply released into open air in almost unimaginable quantities, trusting the odds that some fraction of it, carried on ordinary spring breezes, will happen to land on the right kind of receptive flower somewhere downwind. It is a wildly inefficient strategy by some measures, and a wildly successful one by others, since it costs the tree nothing in nectar or fragrance, and asks nothing of any insect's cooperation. Other trees, cherry and apple and basswood among them, take the opposite approach, producing flowers that are fragrant, colorful, and rich with nectar, an investment meant to draw bees and other pollinators in directly, trading a costly meal for a much more precise and less wasteful delivery of pollen from flower to flower. Records of this exact bargain being kept have been noted for centuries. In fact, the imperial court diaries in Kyoto tracked the blooming date of cherry trees nearly every year since the 9th century. Not for scientific purposes at the time, but for festival planning, and those old entries have since become an unlikely and treasured record of centuries of shifting spring temperatures. Once flowers are pollinated, whether by wind or by insect, the tree's attention shifts toward summer and toward the long, steady work of growth. This is the season of abundance we have already spent so much time inside, canopy fully spread, sugars flowing, water pulled skyward without pause, and it is also the season in which fertilized flowers slowly swell into fruit, whether that fruit is a fleshy cherry meant to be eaten and carried off by a bird, or a dry, papery maple key meant to spin on the wind, or an acorn meant to be buried and half forgotten by a squirrel. Each is a seed wrapped in a different strategy for getting somewhere else, and each takes the full stretch of summer's warmth and light to finish ripening. Then, as day length shortens again in late summer and early autumn, the same phytochrome that once triggered bud break now reads the season in reverse, and the tree begins preparing to shut down for winter. The most visible sign of this, for anyone who has ever watched a New England hillside turn, is the color change in the leaves, and what is actually happening is less a transformation than an unveiling. Green chlorophyll, which has been dominating a leaf's appearance all summer by absorbing red and blue light so efficiently, starts breaking down as the tree reclaims its nitrogen and magnesium for storage elsewhere, and once that green pigment fades, other pigments that were quietly present all along, yellow and orange carotenoids, finally show through. Some trees go further still, actively manufacturing a new pigment, red or purple anthocyanin, in those final weeks, possibly as a kind of sunscreen protecting the leaf's remaining machinery while it finishes salvaging what it can, though the exact benefit is still debated among researchers. At the same time, at the base of each leaf stalk, a layer of specialized cells, called the abscission layer, begins to form, gradually sealing off the leaf's connection to the twig the way a scab forms over a wound, until eventually, a breath of wind is all it takes to send the leaf tumbling down. Losing the leaves entirely, for a deciduous tree, is itself a strategy, a way of shedding thin, vulnerable surfaces that would otherwise freeze and rupture in winter's cold, or that would keep demanding water the frozen ground could no longer supply. But not every tree makes that same trade. Evergreen conifers, the pines and spruces and firs, keep their needles through winter instead, and they can do this because a needle is built so differently from a broad leaf, thick and waxy, with a small surface area relative to its volume, packed with its own natural antifreeze compounds that let its living cells survive being chilled far below freezing without their water bursting the cell walls from the inside. It is a slower, steadier approach, sacrificing the burst of especially efficient summer growth a broadleaf allows in exchange for never needing to rebuild an entire canopy each spring, and across the harshest, shortest growing seasons on the planet, from a mountainside in the Rockies to a windswept slope in Norway, that patience tends to win. Once winter genuinely sets in, our maple stands leafless, its buds already reformed and rewrapped for the following spring, its cambium and living tissue slowed nearly to stillness, and its water content adjusted so that ice, when it forms in the safer spaces between cells rather than inside them, where it would otherwise shred the cell's delicate machinery beyond repair. The tree is not dead, only patient, running on the barest trickle of metabolism, waiting out the cold the same way it has waited out every winter before, for that same pairing of banked chill and returning warmth to arrive again and start the whole quiet turn once more. But waiting is not the same as being unaware. Even in the depths of that banked, trickling winter metabolism, and certainly through every more active month of the year, a tree is gathering information constantly, in ways that have nothing to do with eyes or ears or any of the organs we associate with sensing, and everything to do with cells that respond to gravity, to light, to touch, to injury, to drought, to the chewing of an insect, and even, in some fashion, to the presence of other plants nearby. Start with gravity, since it is in some ways the most basic orientation problem a tree faces, the simple question of which way is down. Charles Darwin, in the last book he published, in 1880, spent a great deal of time watching root tips through a simple lens, turning pots of seedlings on their sides, and timing how quickly the roots bent back downward, and he became convinced that the very tip of the root was somehow directing the whole process, acting almost like a rudimentary brain, sensing gravity and sending some signal back to the growing tissue above it to steer accordingly. He did not have the tools to say what that signal was, but later botanists filled in the mechanism, finding that specialized cells in the root cap contain dense little starch-packed structures called amyloplasts, which are heavier than the surrounding cytoplasm and so settle toward whichever direction is truly down, the way a marble dropped into a jar of honey will always find the bottom no matter how you tilt the jar. Where those amyloplasts settle, they trigger a redistribution of a hormone called auxin, which in turn slows growth on the lower side of the root and lets it continue on the upper side. And that simple asymmetry is enough to curve the root gently downward, day after day, without the root ever needing anything like a nervous system to accomplish it. Shoots use a version of the same gravity-sensing cells, tucked into their own tissues, to achieve the opposite bend, curving upward, which is why a sapling knocked onto its side by a falling branch will slowly right itself over the following weeks, its cells simply obeying the same tilt and settle logic in reverse. Light works on a different but equally elegant principle. A tree cannot see a source of light the way an eye does, but its cells contain proteins, among them one called phototropin, that change shape when struck by blue light specifically, and that shape change sets off the same kind of auxin redistribution used in gravity sensing, this time bending a shoot toward whichever side is receiving the most illumination. There is also a second, separate light-sensing system built around a protein called phytochrome, which is tuned not to blue light, but to the ratio between red and what is called far red light, wavelengths just past the edge of what the human eye can perceive. This matters because sunlight passing through a green leaf comes out changed, stripped of much of its red light, which the leaf has absorbed for photosynthesis, but largely unchanged in its far red content, since chlorophyll has little use for that end of the spectrum. A tree standing in the shade of another tree is therefore bathed in light with an altered red to far red ratio, and its phytochrome proteins can detect that shift before the shade even becomes deep enough to slow its growth, prompting what botanists call the shade avoidance response, a stretching upward and outward, sometimes at the cost of a sturdier trunk, in a kind of race toward open sky. Touch, too, leaves its mark, though slowly and cumulatively rather than in any single startled flinch. Repeated mechanical stress, from wind, from the brushing of a passerby, from the weight of snow, triggers a suite of changes collectively called thigmomorphogenesis, in which a tree's growth hormones shift their balance to favor a shorter, thicker, more flexibly reinforced trunk over a tall, slender one, the plant equivalent of building a squat, sturdy pillar rather than a graceful but easily snapped rod. Foresters have long known this in practical terms, noting that trees grown in the open, buffeted constantly by wind, end up shorter and stouter than genetically identical trees raised in the sheltered stillness of a dense planting, where each one grows tall and thin in the crowded reach for light and rarely learns, so to speak, to brace itself against the weather. Injury calls out an entirely different set of responses. When bark is torn or a branch is broken, cells at the wound margin begin producing a rush of hormones that trigger the formation of callus tissue, a rounded, knotty overgrowth that slowly seals the opening the way scar tissue closes a cut, while in conifers, resin ducts nearby flood the site with sticky sap, both a physical barrier against fungal spores drifting in on the air, and, in many species, a genuinely toxic bath for the bark beetles that might otherwise use the wound as an entry point. Drought brings its own chemical alarm, centered on a hormone called abscisic acid, which accumulates in root cells as the surrounding soil dries and travels upward through the tree's plumbing to the leaves, where it causes the tiny paired guard cells flanking each stomatal pore to go limp and pull the pore shut, cutting off water loss through evaporation at the cost of also cutting off the carbon dioxide a leaf needs for photosynthesis, a trade a tree will make gladly, rather than risk drying out entirely. And when an insect begins to feed, chewing damage releases a hormone called jasmonic acid at the wound site, which in turn switches on genes that ramp up production of tannins and other bitter, digestion-disrupting compounds in nearby tissue, making the leaves progressively less palatable the longer the feeding continues, a slow chemical retreat rather than any single dramatic counterattack. It is this last category of response that has led, over the past several decades, to some of the more widely discussed and occasionally overstated claims about trees, the idea that they can communicate, sometimes summarized in the phrase "warned of danger," as though one tree were shouting to another across a clearing. What researchers actually documented, beginning with work on willows and poplars in the 1980s, was more modest, and in its own way more interesting, that a damaged tree releases volatile organic compounds into the air, airborne signaling molecules including one called methyl jasmonate, and that nearby trees exposed to these compounds sometimes respond by upregulating their own defensive chemistry before any insect has touched them, essentially getting a head start on tannin production the way you might close your windows on smelling smoke from a neighbor's chimney before you have any actual fire of your own. Whether this counts as communication, in any sense resembling what passes between two people speaking, is worth being careful about, since a tree has no intention to warn, no awareness of a listener, and no nervous system to interpret a received message as urgent or otherwise. It simply produces a chemical as a byproduct of being eaten, and another tree, entirely without deliberation, responds to that chemical if its receptors happen to detect it, the way a thermostat responds to temperature without knowing anything about being warm or cold. It is a real and measurable phenomenon, replicated many times since those first studies, but it is a chemical conversation, stripped of any speaker's meaning behind it, less like two people talking, and more like one room's rising heat drifting through a shared vent and nudging the room next door. There is one more layer to how a tree senses its surroundings, though, one that involves not chemicals drifting through open air, but something closer to a signal traveling through the tree's own tissue, and it is there, in the slow electrical pulses moving through a plant's cells, that the story gets stranger still. That electrical story, it turns out, belongs mostly to a single tree's own interior, the slow pulse moving from a wounded leaf to a distant branch faster than any airborne scent could drift there. But if you let your attention widen past the boundary of one tree's bark, past its own private signaling, you start to notice something that gets lost when you study a tree in isolation, which is that a tree in a forest is almost never really isolated at all. Picture standing at the edge of an old, undisturbed forest, the kind that has been left alone long enough to organize itself into layers, the way a house settles into floors over the years even though no one ever drew up that plan. At the very top, poking above the general canopy the way a few tall people stand out in a crowd photograph, are the emergent trees, the oldest and most fortunate individuals that won the long lottery of light and now catch the first and last sun of each day. Below them sits the main canopy, a fairly continuous roof of leaves that most people mean when they picture a forest at all, dense enough that on a bright afternoon it turns the world beneath it the color of pond water, green and dim and cool. Under that is the understory, smaller trees waiting, some of them decades old despite standing only shoulder height, patient in a way that would be unbearable for almost any animal, and below that a shrub layer, and at the very bottom the forest floor itself, where light arrives only in scattered coins that shift across the leaf litter as the canopy sways, and where a person's eyes take a moment to adjust the way they would walking from noon sunlight into a dim hallway. That layered structure is never quite finished, because forests are not static sculptures, but slow processions, and the engine of that procession is often something as simple as one large tree falling over. When an old emergent finally comes down, from age or wind or the ordinary attrition of a long life, it tears a gap in the canopy, and for the first time in decades, a patch of forest floor receives full sun. Seeds that had been sitting dormant in the soil for years, waiting for exactly this, begin to germinate, and fast-growing pioneer species, things like birch or aspen, race upward in a competition that is really a competition for light more than for water or minerals, since almost everything below the canopy is starved for light long before it is starved for anything else. Those pioneers grow quickly and live comparatively short lives, and in their shade, slower and more patient species take root, the same way a temporary shelter goes up first on a construction site before the permanent building rises around it, and eventually a shade-tolerant tree that could never have germinated in that same spot 40 years earlier finds itself standing where the gap once was. The whole cycle a kind of forest memory, written in wood rather than words. Competition in a forest is mostly quiet and mostly happens out of sight. Roots spreading underground in search of water and nutrients the way branches spread above ground in search of light. And one of the odder things to notice, if you ever look straight up in certain forests, is a phenomenon called crown shyness, where the topmost branches of neighboring trees seem to stop just short of touching, leaving thin cracks of sky running between them like the seams of a jigsaw puzzle, an effect biologists still don't fully agree on the cause of, though the leading explanations involve either the tree's twig tips being abraded away by wind-driven contact with their neighbors, or some kind of light sensing that halts growth before collision. Underground, though, this competition sits alongside something closer to cooperation, since the fine roots of most forest trees are wrapped in a partnership with fungal threads called mycorrhizae, filaments finer than a human hair that extend the reach of a root system by orders of magnitude in exchange for a share of the sugar the tree makes in its leaves. Those fungal threads sometimes connect the roots of one tree to the roots of another, occasionally even across species, and research beginning in the 1990s, much of it associated with the forest ecologist Suzanne Simard, found that carbon and other nutrients can move through these shared networks from one tree to another, more from established trees toward struggling seedlings than the reverse. It's tempting, and the phrase has caught on widely, to call this a wood wide web, an internet of trees quietly helping each other, but that framing gets ahead of the evidence in the same way the warning language did earlier, since a fungus moving sugar toward whichever root offers it the least resistance is not the same thing as a forest making a decision to share, even if the net effect, watched from a distance, can look remarkably like generosity. Death, in a forest, is not a subtraction so much as a slow redistribution. A standing dead tree, called a snag, becomes almost more valuable to the surrounding community, alive with insects and fungi, than it ever was as a living, closed system, its softening wood riddled by bark beetles and wood-boring beetle larvae that tunnel through the inner layers leaving trails as intricate as the veins of a leaf. And those insects in turn draw woodpeckers, who hammer out cavities while feeding, and in doing so, carve out nesting holes that they themselves abandon after a season or two, but that owls, flying squirrels, and a whole rotation of smaller birds and mammals then move into, a kind of free housing market passed down snag to snag. Eventually the tree falls, And on the forest floor, it becomes what foresters call a nurse log, its surface softening under a slow procession of fungi and bacteria that break its long cellulose chains back down into simpler compounds, mosses and seedlings taking root along its length in a line that, decades later, a forester might notice as a curiously straight row of mature trees, still following the shape of a log that finished decomposing so long ago. Disturbance on a larger scale reshapes forests too, and not always destructively in the way it first appears. Fire, in certain forest types, is less an intruder than a long-standing member of the cast, and some trees have organized their entire life strategy around it. The lodgepole pine growing cones sealed shut with resin that only melts open in the heat of a passing fire, releasing a fresh crop of seeds directly onto a newly cleared, sun-exposed, ash-fertilized bed of soil, while giant sequoias and old ponderosa pines grow bark a foot or more thick, an armor built specifically to let a low fire pass along the forest floor without reaching the living tissue underneath. Floods work on floodplain forests in a related way, the periodic overflow of a river depositing fresh silt rich in minerals, which is part of why cottonwoods and willows crowd riverbanks the way they do, built for a life of periodic inundation that would drown most upland species. Storms do something similar, but more abruptly. A strong wind, sometimes flipping over dozens of trees at once, their root plates tearing free of the ground in great vertical disks of soil and stone, opening light to the forest floor in patches far larger than any single fallen tree could manage alone. All of it, the fire and the flood and the wind and the beetle and the fungus, moves in the same direction in the end, breaking large, complicated, standing structures back down into the simple minerals and carbon that a forest's next generation will draw on to build itself up again, a cycle with no clear beginning, and, so long as the forest is left to keep running it, no clear end either. What that cycle asks for, more than anything else, is time, and it's worth sitting for a moment with just how much time a forest like this actually needs, measured not in growing seasons, but in centuries. A forest like this, mature and self-sustaining, might need 3 or 4 centuries just to reach what ecologists sometimes call old-growth condition, and depending on the species involved, it can go on developing new structure and new complexity for centuries beyond that, which is one reason a forest cut down today isn't something a person can simply plant back into existence. The trees can be replanted, and often are, but the intricate, patient relationship between fallen logs and living roots, and fungal threads, and standing snags, takes something closer to geological patience to rebuild, and no one now alive will see it finished. Forests like this don't look the same everywhere, of course, and it's worth taking a slow trip around the world to see just how differently trees have learned to live depending on where they've ended up. Start at the top of the globe, in the wide band of forest that circles the northern hemisphere just south of the Arctic, known as the boreal forest in North America and the taiga in Russia, a belt of spruce and fir and larch so vast it holds something like a third of all the trees on Earth, even though almost no one who doesn't live there ever thinks about it. The growing season up there is short, and the winters are long and genuinely brutal, cold enough to split rock, and the trees have made their peace with that in different ways. Spruce and fir keep their needles year-round, small and waxy and packed with a kind of natural antifreeze, ready to start photosynthesizing again the moment a spring sun gets warm enough, without wasting time growing a fresh set of leaves from scratch. Larch does something stranger for a conifer, dropping its needles every autumn like a deciduous tree, turning a soft gold before it does, a habit that seems to have less to do with cold, which the evergreens handle fine, and more to do with the very short, intensely bright summers at high latitude, where a fresh, thin needle can photosynthesize faster than a tough old one for the brief window it actually gets to work. People have lived alongside this forest for a very long time, without ever really settling it in the way farmland gets settled, and the Sami of northern Scandinavia built a whole way of life around reindeer herding that depends on the lichen growing on the forest floor beneath those larch and spruce, a slow-growing food source the reindeer dig for through snow, which means the health of the herd has always been tied to the health of a forest most outsiders would call empty. Move south into the temperate latitudes, the band that holds most of Europe, much of China and Japan, and the eastern half of North America, and the forest changes character again, dominated now by broadleaf trees like oak, beech, maple, and hickory, most of which drop their leaves every autumn in the show of color that draws people out of their houses to go stand under trees on purpose. This is forest built around 4 real seasons rather than 2, with a long enough, mild enough growing period that a tree can afford the cost of growing a whole new set of soft, wide leaves every spring, leaves that are far more efficient at catching light than a conifer's needles, but that would simply die in a hard winter freeze if a tree tried to keep them. Japan still holds pockets of ancient beech forest, in places like the Shirakami-Sanchi Range, forest that has been growing in roughly its current form since long before written history there began, protected in part by terrain too steep and remote for anyone to have bothered clearing it for farmland. Keep moving south and the forest changes again, more dramatically this time, into the tropical rainforest belt that circles the equator through the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, and the islands and peninsulas of Southeast Asia. Everything about a rainforest is built around one basic fact, that the temperature and rainfall barely change across the year, so there's no winter to survive and no dry season to plan around, just a nearly constant warm, wet climate that lets trees grow and photosynthesize continuously, year-round, for as long as they live. That constancy produces the density and diversity people picture when they imagine a jungle, sometimes hundreds of different tree species standing within a single hectare, more species in that one patch than exist in all of Europe combined. The canopy up there is tall enough to form its own weather, and many trees have grown wide, flat buttress roots flaring out from the trunk like the fins on a rocket, an adaptation to soil that's often surprisingly thin and poor, needing extra lateral support since deep roots can't always find much to hold on to. It's a common assumption that rainforest soil must be extraordinarily rich, given what grows out of it. But the truth runs almost the opposite way. Most of the nutrients in that system tied up in the living plants themselves, rather than the ground beneath them, cycling fast from fallen leaf to decomposer to root again, before rain can wash much of anything away. Indigenous communities across the Amazon understood this balance intimately long before any outside scientist wrote it down, managing sections of forest for generations in ways that enriched patches of soil, still identifiable today as dark, fertile ground scattered through otherwise thin rainforest earth. Go up in elevation within those same tropical latitudes, and the forest shifts into something quieter and stranger still, the cloud forest, found on mountain slopes high enough that clouds drift directly through the trees for much of the day, rather than staying safely up in the sky. Everything in a cloud forest is damp nearly all the time, and every available surface, every branch and trunk, tends to be draped in moss, ferns, and orchids, growing not in soil, but directly on the bark of other trees, plants called epiphytes, that take nothing from their host beyond a place to perch, drawing their own water and nutrients from the mist itself. Places like Monteverde in Costa Rica draw visitors specifically for the strange hush of walking through a forest that's constantly being rained on sideways, sunlight filtering down in soft gray light rather than the sharp shafts a normal forest lets through. Down at sea level again, where fresh river water meets the salt of the ocean, a very different kind of tree community takes over, the mangrove forest, made up of the relatively small number of tree species tough enough to tolerate having their roots sitting in salt water for hours at a time as the tide comes and goes. Mangroves solve the salt problem in a few different ways, some filtering it out at the root before it ever enters the tree, others taking it in and then excreting it back out through their leaves, which can be dusted white with dried salt crystals on a hot day. Their tangled, arching roots do double duty as a nursery for young fish and shrimp, sheltered from larger predators, which is part of why the vast mangrove stretches of the Sundarbans, straddling India and Bangladesh, support such a dense population of both wildlife and the people who fish those waters. Further from any coast, in the wide, dry belts of Africa and in patches of South America and Australia, trees thin out into savanna, scattered rather than crowded, standing apart from each other in open grassland, baked by a long, dry season each year. The acacia and the baobab of the African savanna have both made peace with fire and drought in their own ways, the baobab in particular growing a trunk so wide and so full of soft, water-storing tissue that elephants have been known to tear into the bark during the driest months just to get at the moisture inside. And that dry, thinly wooded landscape isn't the last variation worth walking through. That dry, thinly wooded landscape isn't the last variation worth walking through, because some of the most surprising trees in the world aren't defined by the climate they grow in, so much as by some odd trick of biology or scale that sets them apart from nearly everything else with bark and leaves. Start with size, since size is the easiest thing to be amazed by, and also the easiest thing to get slightly wrong. The tallest tree on record is a coast redwood in Northern California, growing quietly somewhere within Redwood National Park, its exact location kept undisclosed by park officials, a small, deliberate secrecy meant to protect it from the kind of foot traffic that compacts soil and damages roots without anyone meaning any harm at all. It stands over 380 feet tall, taller than a 30-story building, taller than most cathedrals, taller than the masts of old sailing ships lashed end to end. It reached that height by growing in a narrow, fog-drenched strip of coastline, where the climate stays mild and wet nearly year-round, and where the tree can pull in extra moisture directly through its needles from the fog itself, tiny droplets condensing on millions of needle surfaces and soaking in, supplementing whatever its roots manage to draw up from so very far below. Picture the physics of it for a moment. Water has to be pulled against gravity through a column 380 feet tall, a feat that would be nearly impossible without that fog acting almost like a second aerial root system reaching down out of the sky instead of up out of the ground. But height isn't the same as bulk, and the title for most massive living tree belongs to a giant sequoia in the Sierra Nevada, a related but different species, nicknamed General Sherman, which is shorter than the tallest redwoods, but so thick through the trunk, so heavy with wood all the way from base to crown, that its total volume outweighs anything else alive on Earth. Its lowest branches alone are wider around than the trunks of most mature trees elsewhere. People sometimes use redwood and sequoia interchangeably, the way people confuse two cousins who happen to share a family resemblance, but they're different species in the same family, suited to different elevations and different amounts of rainfall, one built for height in the coastal fog, the other built for bulk in the drier, thinner mountain air. Age tells its own story, and it's a story that tends to surprise people, because the oldest trees aren't usually the biggest ones. In the White Mountains of eastern California, at an elevation where the air is thin and the soil is little more than broken limestone, grow bristlecone pines that have been alive for more than 4,000 years, alive since before the pyramids were finished, gnarled and half-dead looking, with most of the bark stripped from one side of the trunk and only a thin ribbon of living tissue still carrying water up to a scraggle of green needles at the crown. Seen from a distance, a bristlecone can look less like a living thing than like driftwood standing upright, bleached and twisted by centuries of wind. It seems almost backward that the harshest, least hospitable spots would produce the oldest trees, but that scarcity may be exactly the point. In thin, dry, high-altitude soil, bristlecones grow so slowly that their wood becomes dense and resinous, resistant to insects and rot, and the same harsh conditions that keep other plants from crowding in around them also keep the tree itself under so little competitive pressure to grow quickly that it simply persists, one thin sliver of living wood at a time, for thousands of years. Compare that to a fast-growing tree in a rich, wet lowland, racing upward toward sunlight and outcompeting its neighbors for every inch of canopy space, and it starts to make a strange kind of sense that the tree with the easiest life is often the one that dies soonest, while the tree just barely getting by, rationing its growth like a candle burning low and slow, outlives it by millennia. Then there's a completely different kind of oldness, not of a single trunk, but of a root system, and for that, the best example grows in Utah, a stand of quaking aspen trees covering more than 100 acres, every one of those thousands of trunks genetically identical, connected underground by a single shared root system that may be many thousands of years old, possibly among the oldest living organisms on Earth by some way of counting age. Foresters gave it the name Pando, Latin for "I spread," and from above it looks like an ordinary aspen grove, trunks rising pale and straight, leaves shimmering and fluttering in the slightest breeze, because of how the leaf stem is flattened rather than round, letting each leaf twist and catch the wind from odd angles, a soft, constant rustle, even on days that otherwise feel still. But walk through it, and you're not really walking through many trees. You're walking through one tree, wearing thousands of separate bodies, each trunk a temporary, above-ground shoot sent up from the same continuous root, the way a single plant might send up several stalks from one bulb, only stretched across 100 acres and several millennia. Even if every visible trunk died at once, the organism underground could, in principle, send up new ones and carry on largely unbothered. Baobabs, back in the African savanna for a moment, complicate the picture in still another way, because their strange, swollen trunks aren't really wood in the dense, ringed sense that a redwood's trunk is wood. Baobab trunks are soft, fibrous, and full of water-storing tissue, more like a very large, very tough sponge with bark wrapped around it than a typical trunk, able to swell and shrink slightly with the seasons as it fills and empties like a reservoir. That spongy structure is part of why baobabs don't form the same kind of clean, countable growth rings other trees do, which makes their true ages notoriously hard to pin down, with estimates for the oldest individuals ranging widely depending on the method used, sometimes by 1,000 years or more, between one estimate and the next. Banyans offer yet another surprise, because a mature banyan doesn't really look like it has one trunk at all. It starts life as a seed dropped by a bird into the crown of another tree, sprouting there as an epiphyte, a plant living harmlessly on another plant's branches, before sending thin aerial roots down through open air toward the ground far below. Once those roots reach soil, they thicken into secondary trunks, and over decades a single banyan can spread sideways across an enormous footprint, held up by dozens or even hundreds of these rooted pillars, eventually strangling and outliving the host tree it started on, almost like a very slow, very patient embrace that never lets go. The banyan is technically a type of fig, and its odd growth habit means a big enough specimen can look, to someone standing in the middle of it, less like a tree and more like a small forest, or the inside of some vast wooden hall with columns instead of walls, the kind of quiet, dim, layered space where sound seems to travel differently than it does out in the open. Palms deserve a mention here too, mostly because they raise a question worth pausing on, whether they're really trees at all in the strict botanical sense. A palm trunk doesn't grow the way an oak's does, adding new wood in rings around an ever-thickening core. Instead, a palm's trunk reaches close to its final width fairly early in its life, and then simply grows taller from there, with new tissue added mostly at the very top, which is why a palm trunk feels so uniformly hard and fibrous all the way through, rather than divided into distinct bark, sapwood, and heartwood, the way a true tree's trunk is layered. Botanically, palms are more closely related to grasses and lilies than to oaks or maples, part of an entirely separate lineage of flowering plants that only happens to converge on a familiar shape, tall and single-stemmed with a crown of leaves at the top, rather than sharing any real ancestry with the trees discussed everywhere else in this account. And then, at the opposite end of every scale just described, there's the bonsai, which isn't a species of tree at all, but a technique, a centuries-old practice refined in Japan, though with roots tracing further back to Chinese penjing traditions, in which an ordinary tree, sometimes a pine, sometimes a maple or juniper, is kept small on purpose through careful root pruning, patient wiring of the branches, and a pot just cramped enough to limit growth without killing the tree outright. A well-tended bonsai can be decades old, shaped patiently by a single caretaker, or passed down through several across a lifetime, its trunk gnarled and its proportions aged in miniature the same way a much larger tree ages outdoors over centuries, a small, quiet reminder that most of what makes a tree look ancient, weathered, and slow has less to do with its actual size than with how long and how carefully it's been allowed, or made, to grow. Setting all these varieties side by side, tallest against oldest against widest against smallest, it starts to become clear that tree was never really one single thing to begin with, and that clarity is worth carrying forward into a question that's easy to overlook: what a tree actually needs from the humans and animals living alongside it, and what it quietly gives back in return. That relationship between trees and the creatures living alongside them stretches back long before anyone thought to write it down, and it's worth moving slowly through, because it touches nearly every part of a human life without most of us ever noticing. Shelter is probably the oldest thread. Long before timber framing or log cabins, people likely leaned branches against a trunk, or wove saplings into simple walls, using whatever grew nearby the way a bird uses twigs, not because it was clever exactly, but because it was there, dry, strong enough, and shaped conveniently by nature into something close to what was needed. Picture a person standing at the edge of a clearing thousands of years ago, gathering fallen limbs, not with a plan so much as an instinct, the same instinct that leads a hand to reach for a stick before it reaches for a stone. Later, entire dwellings were built from single trees, hollowed cedar in the Pacific Northwest, split oak beams pegged together across medieval Europe, bamboo lashed into scaffolding, still used today on buildings dozens of stories tall, the poles rising in loose lattices that sway slightly in the wind rather than resisting it outright. Wood bends where stone won't, forgives small errors in a way brick doesn't, and can be shaped with tools no more complicated than an axe and a length of rope, which is part of why it became, almost everywhere humans settled near forests, the default material for keeping weather out. There is something almost tender in that fact, that the material closest at hand was also, by luck or design, one of the gentlest to work with. Food followed a similar path, though it required a different kind of patience. A person gathering wild fruit needed only to find a tree already bearing it, but a person planting an orchard was making a bet on a future they might not live to see fully mature, since an apple tree can take several years before its first real harvest and reach its best years only after a decade or more. It is a bit like planting a slow letter to a grandchild, written in roots instead of ink, meant to arrive fully formed only after the writer is gone. That kind of long-term thinking shows up early in human history. Orchards tended across generations, olive groves in the Mediterranean passed down through families for centuries, some trees still producing fruit today, from roots planted before certain empires existed, quietly outlasting the governments that once taxed their harvest. Figs, dates, mangoes, chestnuts. Each region built at least part of its diet around whichever fruiting trees grew well locally, and in places like parts of the Mediterranean and East Asia, chestnuts and other tree crops weren't just supplemental, they were close to a staple, ground into flour or stored through winter the way grain is stored elsewhere, entire villages timing their year around a harvest that came from trees rather than fields. It's a slower kind of agriculture than a wheat field, but often a steadier one, since a mature tree tends to keep producing year after year with far less replanting and tilling than an annual crop demands, less a yearly gamble than a long-standing agreement between a family and the ground. Medicine drew from trees just as heavily, sometimes in ways that still shape modern pharmacies. Willow bark was chewed or brewed for pain and fever long before anyone understood why it worked, passed down as a kind of folk certainty, something that simply helped, tried, and noticed and repeated across generations without any need for an explanation attached to it. The compound eventually isolated from it, salicin, became the chemical basis for aspirin, so that a small white tablet sitting in a modern medicine cabinet carries, in a distant sense, the same chemistry that once lived quietly under a strip of bark. Cinchona bark, from a tree native to South America, contains quinine, which for a long stretch of history was the only real treatment against malaria, and its bark was carried and traded internationally precisely because there was no substitute, ships hauling sacks of it across oceans the way other ships hauled spices or salt. Not every traditional use held up under closer study, and it's worth being honest that plenty of historical tree remedies were based more on hope than on anything a controlled trial would confirm, but enough of them turned out to contain real, isolable compounds that trees remain, even now, a genuine source of new drug research, chemists still combing bark and leaf and resin for molecules no laboratory has managed to design from scratch, patient work that sometimes takes decades to turn a folk remedy into a proven treatment. Paper changed the relationship again, turning trees into something closer to raw material for ideas themselves. Before wood pulp, paper was made from rags, from papyrus reeds, from stretched animal skin in the case of parchment, all of which were slow or expensive to produce in quantity, so that a single book might represent the skins of an entire small herd. The shift to wood-based paper in the 19th century made printing dramatically cheaper, which meant more books, more newspapers, more of the written record that most people alive today take entirely for granted. An ordinary sheet of paper, suddenly available to nearly anyone, rather than reserved for the wealthy or the powerful. It's a strange thought to sit with, that the pulped fiber of trees is what carries so much of human memory forward. Letters, laws, novels, all of it resting on thin sheets made from something that was, not long before, standing quietly in a forest, unaware that its fibers would one day hold someone's signature, or a child's handwriting, or the text of a treaty. Ships and tools tell a related story, this one bound up with movement and power. For most of maritime history, a ship was essentially a very large, very carefully shaped assembly of wood, oak for hulls prized for its density and resistance to rot, tall straight pines and firs sought specifically for masts, an entire supply chain built around finding trees of exactly the right size and grain. Scouts sometimes traveling deep into forests searching for a single trunk straight and tall enough to serve as a mast for one ship. Wars were fought partly over access to good shipbuilding timber, and empires that ran short of suitable forests found their naval ambitions limited by it in ways that had nothing to do with sailors or strategy, and everything to do with what grew, or didn't grow, within their borders, a kind of quiet dependency hiding behind the more visible business of flags and cannon. Tools followed the same logic on a smaller scale: axe handles, plow parts, wagon wheels, each shaped from whichever wood best matched the stress it would carry. Ash for its springiness, hickory for its shock resistance, a knowledge base built up slowly through trial and generations of craftsmen who could often tell one species from another simply by how it felt under a blade, the weight and grain and give of the wood speaking to hands that had learned to listen to it. Music and story carry the relationship somewhere quieter. Violins, guitars, pianos, drums, a striking number of instruments trace their voice back to a particular kind of wood, chosen for how it resonates: spruce for soundboards, maple for backs and sides, each choice the product of centuries of small experiments in what makes a sound ring clean rather than dull. Luthiers tapping and knocking on raw wood the way a doctor might tap a chest, listening for something true in the tone that comes back. And long before instruments, trees themselves showed up inside the stories people told each other. Sacred groves protected by custom rather than law, single ancient trees marking meeting places or boundaries, myths in cultures scattered across the world in which the world itself grows from or is held up by some enormous tree, its branches reaching into the sky and its roots reaching down into whatever lay beneath everything else. None of that required biology to explain it. It simply reflected how present trees were in daily life, worth remembering, worth building meaning around, the kind of quiet backdrop that becomes, almost without anyone deciding it should, sacred. More recently, and closer to where most people actually live now, trees found a new role as quiet infrastructure inside cities. A shaded street can run measurably cooler than a bare one nearby, sometimes by several degrees, simply because leaves intercept sunlight before it reaches the pavement, and because water evaporating from those leaves carries heat away with it. The same slow cooling a person feels standing under a canopy on a hot afternoon, air shifting almost imperceptibly toward comfort. Urban planners now factor tree cover into decisions the way they'd factor in drainage or lighting, not as decoration but as a functioning piece of a city's climate control, one that also happens to soften noise, filter a portion of airborne particulates, and give people somewhere shaded to sit, a bench under a canopy doing quiet work that a bench in open sun simply can't. All of this use, shelter and food and medicine and paper and ships and tools and music, eventually raised a question that earlier generations mostly didn't have to ask, which is how to keep taking from forests without simply running out of them. That question is what gave rise to forestry as a discipline, the deliberate practice of managing which trees are cut, which are left, and which are replanted. Developed seriously in parts of Europe by the 18th century, once it became clear that unmanaged cutting could outpace a forest's ability to regrow, foresters beginning to think in terms of decades and centuries rather than a single harvest season. Alongside that came a quieter, more patient kind of study, dendrochronology, the reading of tree rings not just to guess an age, but to reconstruct entire histories of drought, wildfire, and climate stretching back centuries, since a ring's width and density hold on to a record of the conditions the tree lived through in that particular year. A thin band of pale wood in an otherwise ordinary trunk marking a summer of scarce rain that no living person remembers, but the tree, in its own slow way, still does. Between managing forests for future use and reading old trees for what they remember, a slow, careful science grew up around trying to understand forests well enough to keep them standing, which turns out to be its own kind of story, one about what it means to take from something living without taking too much. And somewhere in that slow, careful science, if you step back far enough, all the separate threads we've followed start to braid back together into one picture, which is really just a single tree, standing wherever it happens to stand, doing everything at once, quietly, without any sense of hurry, because it has nowhere else to be and nothing else it needs to prove. Picture one now, if it helps. Not any particular species, just a mature tree of ordinary size, rooted somewhere unremarkable, a yard, or a hillside, or the edge of a field. Below the ground, its roots are doing what roots always do, reaching through soil in a pattern roughly as wide as the branches above, though shallower than most people expect, since the majority of a root system's business happens in the top several feet of earth, where water and oxygen and nutrients are actually available. Those roots are pulling in water, molecule by molecule, moving it upward through columns of xylem no wider than a hair, using nothing but the physics of evaporation pulling from above and cohesion holding the water column together beneath it. A system with no pump, no moving parts, just tension held steady across the entire height of the tree. Fungal threads are woven through that same soil, threads too fine to see individually, forming a partnership with the roots that has been running for longer than trees have existed in their current form, the fungus handing over phosphorus and nitrogen scavenged from soil the roots alone couldn't reach, the tree handing back sugars it made in sunlight, an exchange neither side keeps precise accounts of, because neither needs to. Above the ground, the same tree is doing something that still deserves to be called remarkable, even after all this time spent describing it plainly. Its leaves are taking in carbon dioxide through pores that open and close according to conditions, and using the energy in captured light to split water and rearrange carbon into sugar, releasing oxygen as what amounts to a byproduct, a kind of exhaust from a chemical process that predates animal life on land by hundreds of millions of years. That sugar becomes the wood we've spent so much time describing, layer by layer, ring by ring, and it becomes food for the tree itself, and it becomes food, eventually, for a wide range of other lives that the tree never meets and never needs to. Some of that carbon stays locked in the trunk for decades or centuries, held in place as solid wood, quietly out of circulation, which is part of why old forests function as such effective, patient stores of carbon that would otherwise be floating in the atmosphere. Some of it moves outward instead, down through the phloem, out through the roots, offered to fungal partners or, in some documented cases, passed along underground to a neighboring tree, sometimes even a tree of a different species, in an exchange that still isn't fully understood but is clearly more than accidental. Meanwhile, the same tree is managing water on a scale that's easy to underestimate. A single large tree can move dozens, or even over 100 gallons of water from soil to atmosphere on a warm day, releasing it as vapor through its leaves, cooling the air around it in the process, the same way sweat cools skin, and adding moisture back into a system that, at a large enough scale, forests actually help generate their own rainfall for, since the water that rises off one stretch of forest often comes down again as rain over another. That water, before it ever reaches the leaves, has already been slowed and filtered on its way through roots and soil, which is part of why forested land holds water so much better than bare ground during heavy rain, why a hillside stripped of trees erodes and floods in ways the same hillside, forested, generally doesn't. None of this is the tree's intention, exactly, in any sense that involves planning or awareness. It's simply what happens when enough trees do their ordinary business of drinking, releasing, and holding soil in place, across enough square miles, for enough years in a row. And the whole time, all of that is happening below ground and above it, in the water and in the air. The tree is also, without any particular effort, being a structure other lives depend on. Insects are moving across its bark and through its leaves, some of them feeding, most of them simply passing through or making a temporary home. Birds are nesting in branch forks or old woodpecker cavities, using the height for safety the ground can't offer. A layer of lichen might be spreading slowly across the north-facing side of the trunk, growing at a pace measured in millimeters per year, indifferent to almost everything except moisture and clean air. Fallen leaves from seasons past are breaking down at the base, turned over by insects and worms and fungi, releasing back into the soil roughly what the tree drew out of it in the first place, closing a loop that has been closing itself, tree after tree, for longer than there have been humans around to notice it. If the tree happens to be old enough, it may be doing all of this while also carrying scars. A lightning strike healed over decades ago, a broken limb from some storm nobody remembers, bark thickened unevenly around an old wound, each mark a kind of quiet record of something the tree survived without any choice in the matter, simply by continuing to grow. And somewhere nearby, most likely, a person is involved in some small way, whether they know it or not. Maybe someone planted this tree deliberately, decades before, choosing a species for its shade or its fruit, or simply because it seemed right for the spot. Maybe someone prunes it every few years, cutting back a branch that's grown too close to a roofline, a task that, done with any care, requires understanding a little of what we've spent all this time describing, where a tree stores its energy, how a cut heals, which branches matter to its structure, and which don't. Maybe no one tends it at all, and it simply exists, part of a windbreak or a hedgerow or a scrap of woods left standing at the edge of a development, doing its slow work regardless of whether anyone's paying attention, because that work was never really performed for an audience in the first place. It's a strange thing to sit with, how much is happening inside, something that, from a distance, looks like it's doing nothing at all. No visible motion, no sound beyond wind moving through leaves, nothing that reads, to a glance, as activity. And yet water is rising, sugar is forming, carbon is being pulled quietly out of the air and locked into solid wood that might still be standing in 100 years, in an exchange so slow it can only be measured by the seasons that come after it, one leaf fall and one new spring at a time, over and over, for as long as conditions allow. If your breathing has slowed while you've been listening to all this, that's not an accident, and it's not something you need to do anything about. Just let it stay slow. Let your shoulders settle a little further into wherever you're resting. There's nothing left to follow here, No next fact waiting, no thread left dangling, just the quiet picture of a tree, somewhere, continuing exactly as it has been continuing, taking in what it needs, releasing what it doesn't, holding its ground one more night the way it has held it for years before this one, without needing you to stay awake for any of it. Rest well,